All right, and we are on the air. Everybody, welcome into the fifth dimension. And for this episode, I'm joined by Dr. Betty Kovacs. Dr. Kovacs, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the fifth dimension.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's such a pleasure. And, I'm really looking forward to learning from you and, diving into your line of work and what you've been studying. And, many of your studies and what you've been focusing on, center around shamanic mystical traditions, and that in the integration not only with science but history and really a lost side of human history. I'd love to start by venturing into how you found yourself immersing into this line of work, but what also sort of is that you call it a lost blueprint of sort of our conscious evolution. What does that entail?
Yes. Well, I'll start with the first, and that is, how did I get involved in it? And I think, like most of us, we know that in our Western tradition, our materialistic culture, in which we grew up being told there's nothing but matter, you're a fluke of nature, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, and when you're dead, you're dead. Well, that is not a very delightful message to get as you're a child. Although as a child, I didn't quite understand it, but as I did, it seemed like such an empty universe. And of course, there was that longing in me, which is part of the blueprint, that longing to know and to grow and to know and connect and relate to the universe, if there was anything out there.
Right.
So it was that desire that really got me going. And so I didn't know how to go about finding out any of those things, because the kind of conversation that we're going to have today was not a conversation that was had.
Right.
And so I just went to the university and studied, and I didn't know what to study, but I did start with literature, because I thought, well, with literature, in order to understand human beings in literature, I had to study history and many other subjects. So I thought that would be the fullest way that I could try to discover what I was after. And then when I started teaching, I decided that I would teach symbolic language, the myths and dreams and fairy tales, or they're usually called the Märchen. Sounds a little bit more important than fairy tales, but fairy tales are very important, because fairy tales especially, and myth as well, have symbolic language that is structured by the human psyche. I came to realize is that it isn't just a story that someone tells, a fairy tale or a myth. It's a story that is organized and produced by the human psyche. And that organization follows laws or our principles of development, which is our blueprint for development. So I read Carl Jung as well. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to look for that. Right. And he had a profound influence on my life. When I was in college, I was dating a man who had just finished Andover Newton and was going to be a Lutheran minister. And he had a party at his house one evening, and there were men and their girlfriends, but I think it was mainly the men who had gone to Andover Newton. And that night they talked about mathematics and literature and Carl Jung and psychic development. And I didn't know what they were talking about, but I just kept quiet and listened. And then after everyone had gone, we went into his library, and I said, "Who is this Carl Jung?" And I saw volumes by Jung, but I especially noted Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And I said, oh my God, that's what I need. I want that. I'm in search of something. And so that's how I got going. And that's how I taught for years, during the counterculture especially. And I was not much older, sometimes younger than the students that I had. And it was just a great adventure for all of us to read the fairy tales, to read the myths. And while myths have history and the science of the day and biography, there is a core that is symbolic, and that is our blueprint. So we had a great time studying together, you might say.
Right.
Had a great adventure together.
Absolutely. And, that blueprint that you speak of, it almost sort of reminds me of, Joseph Campbell outlined the hero's journey like archetype, where, and it very much, I look at in terms of in personal development, we go through certain phases in our life and we grow and we learn. And, he outlines all of the, how all these different, myths and fairy tales and stories they follow this specific, pattern that, and I very much realize that that is true in ourselves, and that we go through that exact, we can use that as a tool for growth, whether it be, physically, mentally, spiritually, combining all of those things. And, when we look at this blueprint and how it sort of outlines the, conscious evolution as it is, right? And it's natural, our natural state to be following this. Where is it that we were sort of thrown off and almost I don't, it's sort of, I view it sort of as a paradox to say disconnected, because I feel we are intrinsically still connected. It's more of forgotten. So, I mean, where do we find ourselves in history becoming, forgetting this blueprint, if you will?
That's an excellent question. Excellent. It's a core of my book.
Mhm.
But I also want to say, first of all, that your mentioning of Campbell is very important, because I can remember reading his volumes, The Masks of God,
Mhm.
in my 20s. I think I was teaching at the time, and that was so interesting. I later met him, and we
Mm.
had him come speak at the school, and then a friend of mine was close to him, so I met him on several occasions. But meeting him wasn't nearly as important as reading his books. And so, yes, that you have exactly outlined the archetypal pattern. And it is archetypal, which is another way of saying that these stories emerge out of that inner
Right.
psychic organization. And that's why we can tell when a story is, well, we could say true or archetypal.
Right.
And I hope to get into well, I could right now, in answer
Yeah.
to your second question, because how did we lose that is a crucial question. And in my book, I talk about the shamanic cultures that began all around the world at about 40,000 BCE. But
Mhm.
I focus pretty much on Western culture. But if we look at the cave cultures, they definitely were shamanic,
Right.
although many of the scholars who are working in them won't say that they're anything. But now I think there have been two major scholars who have said these are shamanic and given all of the details, and I think it's pretty much accepted. But when you
Mhm.
go into the caves, you know that you know
Right.
that that's what was going on. And also when you see some of the paintings, so they're very shamanic. But at any rate, then the megalithic culture was incredibly tuned in, and they were tuned in through geometry. And
Mhm.
we usually don't think that early people were as bright as they actually were. That was a big mistake in the West. So they even built structures that would help us to see the rhythms and the movements of nature, so that we as an individual could shape our lives in harmony with those rhythms. That was a major way of not forgetting, of staying in
Mhm.
touch with those organizing principles. So it included science, because their temples were observatories. They couldn't even possibly think of separating the conceptual understanding from the spiritual experience of it. But they saw the human being as the mediator between the energies of the earth and the energies of the cosmos. And they had built these incredible structures. Now we know these megalithic structures all around the world.
Mhm.
Something really powerful was going on. They were great builders, and they knew geometry well. And they saw us as the mediator. It was our job to allow those earth energies in us to rise in and through us and connect with the net of light in the universe, bring down those energies through us into the earth, and then hold them in our heart. Well, when we're doing those rituals and all of the structures are around us, and our whole community is practicing rituals to keep in harmony with the earth, then we can stay in tune. But
Mhm.
these cultures there was certainly the Egyptian, which Egyptologists completely missed. They could not see the incredible power and greatness of that culture. They were great shamans and visionaries, and they influenced the rest of Western civilization. But it has taken amateurs, as they call them, to really understand that although Alison Roberts and Jeremy Nadler were really fine scholars who went deep into that culture. For instance, Jeremy Nadler wrote about the shamanic text in the pyramid. So he saw that it was shamanic. And then Alison Roberts did the same thing with the temple paintings and the recordings that are now available on papyrus of their actual rituals. And it's so profound. I mean, I've read them again and again, and I still know that I am missing so much because it's so profound. So that went on, and then the old First Temple Judaism, they also were shamanic visionaries. And that was Margaret Barker who saw that. We didn't know this before the 20th century, really. So we now know that they were too. So they were able to keep it. And then there were later, and we can get into some later, but I want to stop with them because with the First Temple tradition, because in 621 BCE, Josiah was king then, and the Deuteronomist, along with Josiah, made up, I think, a kind of interesting story that, oh, they discovered text in the temple, but really it destroyed the First Temple shamanic mystic tradition. And the way they did that was to destroy everything that was an image of soul, which was the goddess, the feminine dimension of the divine. And she was symbolized as a tree, and she had sacred groves, and people had rituals in those groves, and they had images of her everywhere. She was in the most sacred part of the temple, and all of that was destroyed. And the text, the wisdom texts of how to maintain this particular way of life were destroyed, although thankfully there were Jews who took those texts to Egypt. And I think there were Jews also later in the Babylonian exile who also probably had those texts. And so in Babylon and in Egypt, they kept that tradition going, and it later emerged in Europe as Kabbalah. So it was interesting that this is at least how the First Temple Judaism was destroyed, that shamanic tradition, which was pretty recent, really, if we think about it. And later, when the Roman Church was formed and had power, that was in the 4th century AD, they did the same thing. If I could just say for a moment, what was the major story that so influenced, maybe not Judaism as much because they later had rabbinic commentary, and in the Roman Church, they didn't have that, but that story was of the sacred tree of life. Now, here's a story that is not archetypal. It's an inversion of it. And so here was the sacred tree, and we can see in Sumeria, in 2,500 seals of the god and the goddess saying, here's the tree, eat it. I mean, fruit hanging from the tree, and it was take it. It was never forbidden. But here we have in Genesis, the Deuteronomist, having God say, you can eat of everything you want to eat in the garden, just don't eat of this tree.
Right.
of knowledge or good. Well, of course, we all know as parents, the moment you say that, that's a tree. But at any rate, this is an inversion because it had always been, of course, this is for you. And what divinity, who's truly a divinity, would say, we don't want you to be conscious.
Right.
And it's just crazy. So here we can see that this is a false story. It is not organized by the principles of the psyche. And when they do, of course, all evil befalls them, and Jesus, or not Jesus, God, Jesus says later he doesn't do anything like that. The God curses Eve in childbirth, curses Adam with the earth. Nature is cursed, And
Mm.
that has some effect on our whole attitude toward nature. But, you know, we think even if we don't go along with that myth, it still has affected Western culture because it is a structure within our consciousness. We are, only God is divine.
Mm.
And of course, and then he says, you will die if you eat of it. Well, the tree, when we eat of the tree and the archetypal blueprint story, we know we are immortal. We
Right.
know we are divine too. And we know that we are creative. All of these things are destroyed in that story and written by the Deuteronomist. It is, it has caused incredible damage to the development of consciousness. And when the Roman Church picked it up, they kept that story and they made a lot more of it, I think, than was made in Judaism.
Right.
And then they also inverted the Jesus story, because Margaret Barker gives a convincing story that Jesus, that tradition of Jesus in which he taught a secret hidden tradition, was the same as First Temple Judaism, the shamanic mystic tradition.
Mm.
Jesus was a rebirth of that and the mystics surrounding him. This was the tradition,
Right.
but the church inverted that archetypal story of each of us becoming Christ into, no, no, you're not worthy. You follow the outside Christ and worship something outside you. Whereas later, when the Nag Hammadi texts were found, right after the war, and they were texts, more Gnostic texts, but they were also used during the early formation of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, when you drink from my lips, you and I are one. And we were not to follow him, but to become Christ. So it was all about Christ consciousness, reverting back to the blueprint. But the
Mm.
church inverted the blueprint, as the Deuteronomists had done. Of course, they didn't have Jesus, but then they took Jesus and inverted him. So always, we are not divine. We are not immortal. We are not creative. And that has damaged Western culture deeply. So the answer to the question of how did we get thrown off? Well, by people in power who wanted more power, the Roman Church, and their military branch, the Habsburg dynasty.
Right. And you laid it out so beautifully that you can clearly see how that externalization process has that foundation was built upon, and through the years just continue, where we seek outside of ourselves for fulfillment. We lack that divine connection that was inherently there and part of
Yeah.
human history and part of the blueprint. And by telling us to seek outside of ourselves, through years of technological innovation, we get to the point of where we're at now, where society is so incredibly externalized that everything is, taught to be seek through external fulfillment, whether it just be, our livelihoods and jobs and relationships. We've lost that sacred connection that uh, it it's supposed to exist, supposed to be there. And because we're so far removed from it, it feels almost a far cry to imagine a society that has that connection as sort of the collective blueprint, a society that's living by that. How can we begin when, science is a field that, we look at scientific innovations, and there's certainly been wonderful technologies that we do have now. And, like, we're sitting here on a computer however
Yeah.
many miles apart, right?
Right.
There's so many beautiful things that it's done, but it, the scientific method really hammers in that externalization focus and materialism. And how would you say we can begin to merge the ideas of shamanism with the science that we have now and create something that is more harmonious and complementary of one another, and make it more emulate our natural state of how we are supposed to be, one with nature? Like, how can we create that complement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think that we can look at these older civilizations that did do that,
Mm.
because always when there was a shamanic culture soon there would be the development of a science that was an attempt to understand what they had experienced. And we have to say too that in the cave cultures and in other cultures, they developed techniques of experiencing altered states. In the cave cultures, it's now known they could very well have had sacred medicine, sacred plants, because they have found mushroom and evidence of it in the teeth of people at that time. So they probably did, but it was used in a way, probably not as the 60s used it, when it just burst upon them and that they knew nothing. It was not a tradition,
Right.
but it was a very sacred tradition in which they meditated and went into a deep state of higher consciousness and could actually experience the cosmos. And of course, when they came back to ordinary consciousness, they absolutely wanted to understand it. And their experience there actually gave birth to the science. And I think of people during the 60s who became incredible scientists because they had used sacred medicine and they understood the universe in a way they couldn't possibly just from their studies. So that really changed the world in that sense. But they didn't all use sacred medicine. They knew rituals, and it's now known that some of the rituals which they performed actually, you know, it almost always has a repetitive movement in it, that these rituals actually integrated the various brain components with the heart. Now that is something to achieve.
Right.
And I think that that's the kind of things that as educators or just simply people who want to know things, we need to know what techniques can we develop that help us to integrate the various components of the brain with the heart, because then we have a higher consciousness. But what was your second question?
So, you know, how with that playing off of, a heart-centered consciousness as well. I love that you brought that up. How can we use that to integrate shamanism with sort of the material science that we see now? Is there a way to,
That was it,
is there a way to create that harmonious balance moving forward?
I think so. And I think one of the big movements was when quantum physics was developed in the early part of the last century, is that those physicists knew when they started becoming aware of what was going on, they knew that everything was going to change. And they started reading these shamanic, mystic texts of our past, but they couldn't figure it out. It took maybe 50 more years or so for other scientists working independently around the world to begin to see what was going on. And in the 70s, some scientists in the UK got together and said, you know, since quantum physics, we can't just have hard science now. We have got to look into consciousness. And so the Scientific and Medical Network was born out of that. And I'm a member of that, and I've spoken there. They've invited me to speak about the visionary experiences and the shamanic experiences, but they have both scientists and visionaries, and they are doing an incredible work, and you might be interested in them, Scientific and Medical Network. And they have all kinds of programs now on the internet because they can't meet. But and it's a very exciting organization. And I think there are other organizations. And so they're asking the same question you did. How can we do this? But especially we have to bring science to it, because science was always a part of shamanism. And it's a part of the universe. So of course it would be. But I know where I wanted to go and forgot was after the cave cultures is to the San Bushmen. And it's wonderful that we know about them because they were looked down on by white culture for so long. And I think it was in the 30s when South Africa stopped selling licenses to hunt them, if you can imagine.
Wow.
Well, they have an incredibly beautiful tradition, and it has lasted, they say, from 60,000 years. They have been doing these rituals. They do rituals that open their hearts and minds to cosmic consciousness. They dance. And so it is the repetitive dancing and the music and the chanting but there are many elders. Many of the women were shamans, many of the men were. And when Bradford Keeney, I think it was,
Hmm.
went there and discovered them and how incredibly developed they were. And it's a kind of interesting story how that happened, because he was playing the piano and he had a mystic experience, and it lasted all night until the next morning. And he didn't know what to do with it because, of course,
Hmm.
people weren't. So he went to MIT. Well, at any rate, he became a professor, and he was invited to teach in a university in South Africa. So he went. He was going to go there, and 2 weeks before he went, I think about that time, he had a dream in which he was shown that a map was given him in this dream of exactly where he should go when he got there, and just absolutely circled it in the Kalahari Desert. And he did. And he got a team when he got there and went to the Kalahari Desert where the San live. And as he was crossing the desert, some of the San Bushmen were running toward him, and they said, "Oh, welcome. We've been waiting for you."
Mm.
And he, along with others who had a real deep sense of the Bushmen in the Kalahari, well, Graham Hancock calls them the murdered people. They were murdered. And there are very few now in Namibia and Botswana, but they have released through Keeney their teachings. As I put it out here in case the way of the Bushman as told by the tribal elders, spiritual
Mm.
teachings and practices. So uh, they were so surprised when Bradford Keeney told them that there were people who meditated all alone in order to achieve cosmic consciousness, and they just couldn't believe it because it is a communal thing. And I think that's what it was in the beginning. It was communal. We're all a part of each other, and that they will dance together and touch and hold each other, dance together, so this energy flows through them. And
Mm.
what I think is just absolutely incredible, they know how to shape this energy like a little arrow and throw it, and it can actually ignite that energy in another. Isn't that kind of
Wow,
amazing?
that's beautiful.
Yeah. And, in the cave cultures, I had seen people kind of floating and with arrows in them or
Hmm.
needles. And I think the cave cultures knew that technique too. I think that's what it is, because I know they practiced shamanism. And who knows, maybe even the Bushmen were came before the cave cultures. We say the Bushmen were 33,000 BCE. They say, 60,000. And so they may well have influence, and why not, the cave cultures in Europe. But this to me is, we need to know these things. We need to know how we can activate and integrate all of this that we are, so that, and I think it will mean a community. We do it together. I went to South America 2 times with shamans,
Hmm.
and they would always say, we would never feel competitive. If one person in the group has an extraordinary experience, that means we all can. And so
Mm.
it's communal.
Right, definitely. And it's so beautiful that they have the Bushmen. It's I feel thankful that they haven't been, Graham Hancock. I've studied a lot of his work as well. I feel thankful that they haven't been completely wiped out, and we almost sort of are having this realization to come back to this sacred knowledge right on the cusp of where it's all like, if we kept going any further with sort of this material outlook, we would not only completely disintegrate that knowledge, but disintegrate ourselves in the process, because the way we live disconnected from that is so out of balance and so destructive. So, with like altered states and with sort of, I feel a return to this natural heart-centered consciousness and combining of the mind and the heart and communal uh, culture. I feel like with shamanism, it's making this comeback, and we, plant-based medicines, and ayahuasca is making a huge Mother Ayahuasca is making a huge resurgence, if you will. Plant-based medicines are starting to find Western culture in ways and really integrate itself within. And I feel we're almost seeing the, I guess you could say, I don't want to say the doubling down of materialism from the powers that be, but I think it, the structure we've created almost has its own uh, life to it, and it recognizes when it's uh, being tested. So we see sort of a doubling down on it, but I think it's going to, it's only a matter of time, I guess, before we see this return to a more natural state, because I think more people feel this connection, more people feel this energy within themselves. And because of, the tools that we have with like the internet and with, you know, being able to hear about these experiences, more people are recognizing that within themselves. There's the cave cultures and the Bushmen had these similar practices because they both recognize that within them. Like anybody can feel that energy. Anybody can tap into that oneness, uh, that heart-centered consciousness. So, I mean, would you say that a heart-centered tapping into that could be a solution for us moving
Oh,
forward? And like,
yeah.
how can individuals who maybe are in the we're so many of us are caught up in our material lives and in this externalized reality, how can people begin to tap into that within themselves?
Yes, well, you've really pointed out a very important thing that's happening. I realized in my research that while we knew about the cave cultures, we didn't know enough. And while
Mm-hmm.
we knew about megalithic, we didn't know enough. In the 20th century, scholars have come forth, not connected with each other, and have revealed the depth and the power of these cultures. And it really took place in the 20th century. And I'm thinking, this is very interesting. The universe has, of course, its own laws and its ways of working with us. And
Mm-hmm.
I don't think for a moment this is a fluke, that
Right.
we were rediscovering the power of who we are in the 20th century. We had lost so much of it, unfortunately, to organized religion and then the reduction of science. And that reminds me that I want to say that in the 1600s, there was really a rebirth of this shamanic, early 1600s, shamanic, mystical, scientific tradition. And they were studying science. In fact, it was this tradition that gave mathematics, you might say, a way of understanding nature through mathematics
Mm-hmm.
to scientists. But in 1620, they tried to get enough political power to have a real effect. They wanted to bring about a real enlightenment, just as we're talking about. Well, the church and the Habsburgs got together and completely destroyed it. Their
Mm-hmm.
texts were thrown out into stables and could never be recovered, into the streets, and they lost power. And everyone knew, and the scientists knew, who were part of that group, that if they could not study consciousness, the inner dimension, any longer if they wanted to live. Now, in I think around 1660, something like that, the Royal Society for Scientists was formed in England. They didn't touch what we're talking about because they wanted to live. And eventually science forgot why they were restricted. But I think it's very important to know that the church is what actually helped to bring about this limited, non-spiritual, materialistic world, because the
Mm-hmm.
scientists could do nothing else but study matter. And eventually they thought there wasn't anything else.
Right.
And now in quantum physics, it's come full circle. They have really discovered the multidimensional world. Paul Lavey, who is a writer and a Buddhist and a therapist, I loved when he said that the discovery of quantum physics is our collective dream to save ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
No more of this limited materialistic thing. And I think he's absolutely right. And because of that, we really have efforts by scientists who also are open to the visionary and the mystic, coming together. And that's, of course, what SciMed does. But there's a danger here, because not only has this emerged, but all the while, this roots in this materialistic scientist and controlling behavior and the whole mechanism of life. They've forgotten and do not value the inner power of the individual, the spirit, the soul, the heart. They don't value it. So we have in our culture a real thrust and actually an actual plan to actually control all of society and going absolutely toward full artificial intelligence and control. And then here we are.
Right.
And I think many people who are really trying to discover this power in ourselves, it's very easy to feel that this other is so powerful that they will take over, and like the Roman Church, except even more powerfully, because they have tremendous power to control and surveil and know and control. And then here we are, and we have to completely free ourselves from the stories that we are nothing. We are so powerful. Once we allow the brain components to fuse in the heart and to be able to love, then that heart is connected with the cosmic heart. And who is it? Michael Meade, I think, said that one person has the power to ignite the entire collective and change the world. This is the story we have to help ourselves remember,
Right.
especially when we're up against all this outer physical technology. It can be used beautifully. We're so grateful for it, right?
Right.
It can be used beautifully, but only we can determine that it is used in a soulful way. So I think something really very powerful is going on, that we have this mechanical artificial intelligence control of all people. And then we have this rebirth of these ancient cultures, which you said, it's like it's so natural. Yes, the natural mode of our development, if we stay in tune with the rhythms of nature and our own psyche, soul, we will naturally develop that. The dreams and the visions will give us those symbols of the true myths and the true stories that guide us on our way. So we've got to stay very, very focused and strong in accepting the power that we have. It depends on, I think it's a tremendous crossroads of everything that's gone forth since the cave cultures. This is the crossroads. And one is domination and art, in a kind of technological way. And the other is the inner development. I mean, if we would talk to some of these people about the psyche, the soul, the heart, it's like, what are you talking about?
Non-existent.
It's
Right.
like another one of those crazies, But we have to know that so that our power can be released.
Right. Absolutely. And it's interesting you brought up that AI, artificial intelligence, technological society, because that's something I've been, thinking a lot about and seeing how the groundwork has been sort of laid out for that. Like the foundation has been built, and there's so many technological dystopian novels that you could read.
Yes.
And I think I just read 1984 a couple weeks ago, and I just Orwell had beautifully outlines what could potentially
Saw what was coming.
right there. It's very much a control over perception, control over our states of consciousness, because with sort of this externalization of our reality, we're already sort of on the cusp of losing touch with our natural state, and the next step of that would be a lack of control over our own consciousness, which
That's, yeah.
with the potential AI has the potential to uh, essentially take that over with. And so many people in the external, if they're in the external and not connected to that source, not connected to the natural world, it's very easy to be manipulated into that line, into complying with that and just sort of going along. But I feel like there's almost this need for balance within ourselves and the technology, and finding a way how we can create almost, I would say, order within let the natural world create order, create the society that we all feel, because we can feel the connection with one another, with nature, that oneness, that unity that we spoke of, like that has a feeling. And maybe we can't physically picture in our minds what a collective that goes by that in the 21st century would look like, with all of our technology and with how the world operates right now. But if we follow that feeling, I feel that the natural world would guide us in that direction.
I think absolutely. And these stories, these archetypal stories. And another organization that's bringing science and experience together is Heart Math.
Hmm.
Do you know about Heart Math?
I
It's
don't believe I do.
well, you'll love it. And they do a lot of exercises to help people in breathing techniques to connect to have coherence, they call it, with the brain components and the heart. But they've also done so many studies, and they say we're now, through science, realizing what our ancestors knew all along. They had intuitively developed these techniques, and so they're trying to develop it now. But young school children who were having trouble in school, when they went to Heart Math and they could learn the breathing techniques and get coherence, they did so much better in school. And we are less violent when we are coherent, when we have this rhythm, and our thoughts and feelings are so much more loving.
Hmm.
And so it's I think they have actually shown that we become the human being we want to be through this connection to the heart. So they've actually done studies, and people who are recovering from illness do so much better. So there's a lot of science behind connecting to the heart.
Hmm.
But so I think that we do, knowing, I think, and that's one reason that I wanted to write this book. And of course, I was discovering all kinds of things as I went along. But knowing that this was the natural mode of development for our ancestors. And then there were people outside who had not had that development. And since they didn't go within, they didn't know what was waiting for them. They
Hmm.
could only find power and control outside themselves. And so they just became crazed with it, as we see in our world.
Right.
And I think that, there was in the Nag Hammadi text, there was also a saying, many wonderful sayings by Jesus. And he said, if you bring forth what is within you, it will heal you.
Hmm.
But if you do not bring forth what is within you, it will destroy you.
Hmm.
And I kind of think that's what we're doing. And what we see, you could get control in the outer world, and that somehow fills an empty ego. I don't think, so many people talk about getting rid of the ego. I think the ego is a wonderful part of us if it is turned within.
Hmm.
Then it reflects that which is within us to the world, and that's our medicine to the world. But if we don't go within, I think it gets flipped wrong side out. And
Right.
and we just have frantically want to control everybody and everything, and all of the rest of the things that we see today in our culture. So I think that we've become very ill, very wounded, and we
Hmm.
have to do business with that.
Right.
We have to understand how did they become so wounded, and what wounds do I have in me that I
Hmm.
can heal to help them heal. But I really feel that this is a time when we really have to remember the inner force and power of the creative, divine, immortal individuals that we each of us are. And also we can get in touch with that by being in harmony with nature. And
Right.
not, our whole culture is constructed in a way to pull us out of ourselves, and always be entertained or always hear something, rather than that other way of life, which can be very exciting and adventurous, whatever, but it would be rooted within. And that's a real challenge. I think if we can't do that now, if we can't do that so that we can heal those who don't want it
Right.
and only want an artificial world, I think it's a real, this is our task, I think, for now.
Absolutely. It's like the great challenge that is presenting itself to humanity
Yeah,
and to people
yeah.
who in particular have this awareness of the inner. It's almost becomes once you gain that awareness of the inner. I noticed for me, I always wanted to be a teacher. I thought like helping children, like I teach history and I was like, oh, that it would be nice to be a teacher. But once I gained the awareness of the inner, my priority within teaching shifted let's from the content to more of let's self-actualize the children.
Yeah.
Let's make sure that students have inner awareness and know how to fully process what it means to be a human. I mean, it's a game of discovery, the game of life, but you know learning early on to engage with shadow work and engage in
So good, yeah.
full parts of ourselves. I don't think there's anything more important to that, because you gain that sense of fulfillment from within as opposed to looking externally for it. And I myself do breath work every morning, and I have a mindfulness meditation practice I do, and I feel like it's what can be grounding and help optimize my own well-being and allow me personally to go into the world and attempt to fulfill this purpose beyond the individual self. Like when you can tap into this world of the inner, you realize how much more there is beyond the individual self that exists
Mm-hmm.
within you. The inner is almost, it's, you see that you are just a uh it, the essentially the universe incarnated into a human.
It is, exactly. But and I love that. I mean, the shadow work, the work within. And I just did a video called The Frequency of Love in a Dying World.
Mm,
And that uh, we really, by going inward, we can ignite that frequency in ourselves. But the first order of work is always working on our own darkness. And
absolutely.
because, we can't heal anybody outside ourselves. We have to heal ourselves. And in that process, we can work with others, as you did, in a way that will help us to be in touch with that and not always project it outward. I wanted to say, too, something that we didn't know until a particular scholar of the 20th century discovered it, and that was Peter Kingsley discovered that, or realized that, the pre-Socratic philosophers from Anatolia or Turkey, they're Greek, but they were living there,
Mm,
they actually were powerful shamans. Now, this is about 500 BCE, and they were such powerful shamans that they would go into altered states for days or
mm.
at least hours. And he says, and what is his book, the dark, what? The dark places, yeah, places was right. Yeah, Kim's here. The Dark Places of Wisdom by Peter Kingsley. He so beautifully talks about these philosophers, and they really gave wisdom to Plato.
Mm.
It was reduced by Plato and those who followed, but these were very powerful visionaries. And they actually, in the visionary world, they came up with all of the disciplines of Western culture. So, as he says, our roots really are in pre-Socratic philosophy. And these philosophers were profound shamans. There's even a story told that some of them could, they'd go into a state for days and then they could even heal whole cities.
Wow.
Well, a shaman would say that too. So I think we didn't know until Peter Kingsley that our immediate roots in Western culture are shamanic too, and very
Mm,
powerful shamans, because they would actually have people come in, and through sleep and through their guidance, they could help people to become more conscious. They were great healers. Why didn't we know this? You know,
Mm.
I tried for years in reading Greek literature and history. I could never find anything about shamans. Well, Peter Kingsley shows how there was a shamanic culture all the way from Spain throughout all of North Africa and Europe, all the way into Central Asia. And he could even trace their connection through their poetry and language. We didn't
Wow.
know this. So I think one thing is discovering our past and how our ancestors knew what we're talking about and how to get in touch with various methods. I think we can create whatever we need to do this job, you know, and
Absolutely.
and I think knowing it is a first step.
Right, definitely. And getting back in touch with that foundation. Like I myself wouldn't have known that the Western foundation, it's has shamanic roots, but it
Can you
kind of,
imagine? Yeah, we
right.
didn't know. I didn't know. That's a 20th century, thank heavens. And I think I didn't know either. I hope that Egypt did. But
Right.
when Jeremy Nadler uh, translated the pyramid texts, they are shamanic. And then when uh, Alison Roberts, when, you know, the temples were more available, I mean, in terms of being able to see the paintings and read the definitions, it's profoundly shamanic. And they have been very, very instrumental in everything that's happened in the West, because they connected this Hermetic tradition, Egyptian tradition, connected in Egypt with the pre-Socratic philosophers who, once Christianity in 400 had the power it had, it was not allowing anything else to live. So they
Mm.
came together in northern Egypt, then went down a little bit further in Akhmim. And then when the pressure got so great, they went over to Baghdad and finally to Persia with the Sufis. And in the High Middle Ages, the Sufis came back into Northern Europe. And it really blossoms in Chartres Cathedral in the High Middle Ages, is the Christianity of finding the Christ within, becoming Christ consciousness. So, but it was the Egyptian with alchemy and Kabbalah and Sufism, and they all
Mhm.
worked together. And I never knew that they were that united, you know, that they
Right.
became united and connected, and they were able to feed, in a sense, each other, but they had to always run and hide from the church.
Right. Definitely that power structure that is actively looking to suppress
That's right.
that empowerment of the individual. And you know, I think what we're talking about just shows the interconnectivity that is
Mhm.
all human beings when we can all access this Christ consciousness that you speak of. And you know that existed not just in Europe, it existed
No,
in North
everywhere,
America, South America, like that. And
everywhere.
when you look at all of the indigenous cultures and all of the practices they had, it becomes clear that humans' natural state is in this heart-centered consciousness
Mhm.
and living in that place of love and community and oneness. And so a return to that is ultimately, I feel, the next step of our evolutionary growth, because you know the universe from the moment it was created, however billions of years ago, it's just constant growth, evolution, constant growth,
Mhm.
evolution. And that's, you know, we're no different than from that. So you know, a material outlook oftentimes, you know, it only focuses on that physical growth. And but a lot of times we see, in terms of us as a species, there's almost this stagnation. You know,
Yes.
I think human history, the Western cultures in particular, are the downfall is thinking we are at this pinnacle
I know
of,
we, yeah.
right, that we're at this pinnacle of, we've made it as far as we can in terms of our own evolution. Like we are at the top. Like we can't, there isn't this long-term uh out connection to the evolutionary process.
Exactly. And if we think about the great Enlightenment philosophers of the 1700s, they discovered in all their wisdom that they had reached the apex you're talking about, rationality. It had been
Mm.
differentiated, and now they were rational thinkers. And they came up with some good ideas that we've not usually ever been able to live with and carry out because our heart was not developed. But their whole point was that everything that came before is nonsense. We are the apex, rational thinking only. And so they, along with material scientists, actually created the Western culture, you might say, because they were saying, look, I don't care how you feel. I only care about your thinking. Is it logical? Is it rational? At the same time that these people were singing their praises of living on a shining hill in France and wanting to change all of Europe, there was Giambattista Vico in Italy in the 1700s who was writing about the other dimensions of consciousness. He saw very clearly this was not nonsense. And he didn't have right brain, left brain, but he talked about the symbolic brain and the conceptual brain or mind. And he saw that the first language, our first language is symbolic, and that this deep truth will express itself in symbols, as we've talked about with myths and fairy tales and other types of experiences, that this symbolic structure then feeds the left brain, and the left brain can translate it into rational consciousness. Without this brain, the rational brain is in trouble, which we have been in trouble.
Right.
But then he says, symbolic language should never be reduced to conceptual language, nor should conceptual language ever be reduced to symbolic. They belong together, and they feed each other. They have this beautiful dance back and forth, and they both need the other in our mental development. And he understood that so well, but of course he wasn't listened to, because the people who were saying we have achieved it, we're the greatest people who've ever lived, and that did great detriment to our culture. And in every time there's a rebirth of this shamanic wisdom, because it did go underground each time, it didn't die entirely, that every time it comes up, and I talk about that in the book, there are 5 times, and today is one of them. But every time it came up again, Vico was important because they understood. But now we have other thinkers and other scientists who also know, and they also know that that a true education will have a technology that nurtures the human being and its interconnectedness and its relationship to the earth and the cosmos, and certainly to each other, that's the kind of technology that we need to put in service of the heart and the soul and all life.
Right, absolutely. And that's such a beautiful way to put it. And, being in this, the 5th time the shamanism has emerged, we can only sort of hope that it doesn't, all the other times we've seen this sort of suppression of it and doubling down on the old material ways. This time it almost, maybe because we're living through it and experiencing it and can really analyze and see it for what it is, and transmit that message on such a large scale through, the use of the internet and through free-flowing conversations and dialogue that can be, in theory, anybody could go and listen to this conversation anywhere in the world just by clicking a button. So it's
that is the beauty of technology too, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
And it's like we can returning to that natural state, that balance, and integrating that. And it's I feel personally hopeful that this is we're in the beginning stages of this large scale movement towards heart-centered consciousness that will stick around, that isn't going to be squandered or suppressed. And
I think so. When I was in my 50s, I had 3 deaths in my family. My mother was killed in a car accident. Then our only child, when he was 20 years old, was killed. 2 years later, my husband was killed in his home country, Hungary. He was there for a while. We had many visions after Pishti died. And my husband was a businessman, and he honored me, but he wasn't interested in that. Well, he did become very interested, because we were in touch with our son's consciousness after his death, and in very deep, precise ways. And I wrote my first book about that the miracle of death, there is nothing but life. But we had visions about, first of all, when he first came through, it's like he wanted us to remember, to know that there is no death. He's still alive, he's still creating. But he also wanted us to know what the earth would be going through in the next years. And we learned a lot from that. But I also, and my husband too, had many experiences of people being born on the earth who had come to help us. We had called for them because we know we need help, and they could only come if we called for them. But people are coming to work with us. And another thing, and we are quite capable ourselves, we just have to wake up to who we are. But another thing is that we realized that if we work on, as they put it, what is decayed within us, if we work on that darkness within us, that we actually activate a higher frequency of laws that work with us to do what you and I are talking about. So I'm hopeful. Sometimes when I see our insanity, I get worried, but then I realize our job is to try to heal the insanity within me. But I am hopeful because I think we can expect miracles because that's higher laws. Miracles are what can happen when a higher frequency of laws has been brought to the earth. And I think we are bringing that to the earth with the work that we want to do. So I'm hopeful. I mean, I think that's a very powerful understanding that the laws, yes, we can expect something very different.
Absolutely. And I think
we cannot look at the old laws of materialism. I'm sorry.
Right. No, yeah. And you put it so beautifully that we can expect miracles. And I've experienced miracles in my own life and know that, I meet more and more people who are beginning to awaken with this sense within themselves that the domino effect of how many people he awaken and then help others awaken within themselves. And it's at a point where it feels that that first domino has been toppled over, and it's just going to keep going and going and going. And it's only a matter of time before the collective is just a macrocosm of the individual, what's going on with the majority of individuals. So it's eventually, if you have the majority of individuals reawaken to love and connection, it'll be that collective is bound to shift.
It's bound to. And if we remember too that every thought, every feeling, every idea ripples throughout the entire cosmos. We do have an effect on the cosmos. And so, of course, we would have a profound effect on each other. But as our ancestors always tried to teach us, that the greatest gift we can give anybody is the gift of our own becoming conscious, heart conscious. That's a great gift. And that will ripple throughout the universe. And of course, when we do something pretty bad, that also ripples,
Right.
So, but I agree with you entirely. And I do choose to be optimistic and hopeful. Yeah.
Right. That's all we can do when we're at this point, and just go through and keep with the insanity best we can and live out of a place of love. And
well, I think that is it. That we have to remember that place in the heart of love has far more power than the millions and millions of dollars and organizations to control us. We have to remember the heart is more powerful than that. I can forget it from time to time.
Right. It's easy to.
Yeah, but memory to remember.
Absolutely. So, Dr. Kovacs, we're at about an hour. I mean, that really flew by for me personally.
It did. It did.
But, so, I mean, is there any sort of last message that you'd want to leave the listeners with, or where they can even go to, engage with your books further, and sort of just points that you would send the listeners, in what direction you might put them in?
Well, both books, The Miracle of Death and The Merchants of Light, the consciousness that is changing the world. These two books are on Amazon, or they can be purchased anywhere books are sold, actually. And the website is kamlak.com, KAMLAK.com. And yes, I think that, yes, my message would be our message, is that we have to remember who we are.
Right. Beautiful. And, I will link the links to the books and the website in the
Oh,
episode description.
great.
So,
Thank you.
people can just scroll on down and, click on it, check it out. It's right there. I myself am very interested, and I would love to read your book. So I'm going to, go and purchase a copy for myself. So,
Oh, good, good. Well, I just have so enjoyed talking with you, and the work you do is so important.
oh, I truly appreciate that. And, I've really enjoyed this conversation as well. I feel like I've learned a lot. Like it's really reaffirming, like, because a lot of, I'm very intrigued by a lot of the shamanistic concepts. And I feel like I don't have a huge like a history. Like I haven't studied enough of the history, but I feel like I'm very in tune with a lot of what is the message.
And you are, for sure.
So so this has been a very rewarding conversation for me as well.
Oh,
And
for me too.
I love the work that you're doing. And I think it's so important to get that message out there. So
it is for all of us. And we're working at it, aren't we?
yes. I mean, like one podcast at a time, one book at a time, one person
right.
at a time, right? That's really what it takes. So
yes. Well, thank you so much.